Oh no, pwede matotso pogo, pwede matotso estinabiyay. Hungyan. Right. Umalam taloy bisita. All right. All right, William, you are back. The live stream is working now, and we are just about to get started and just checking to make sure that the live stream is working. And oh yeah, Enigate Hungyan, there it is. All right. All right, half a day. Todos hamzugwana hudzung estigi un nuevo episode Fanatsu Guahui host Mizutalo si Michael Luhan Bavakwa. Hello, everyone out there. This is another episode of Fanatsu. I am once again your host, Michael Luhan Bavakwa. And if you tuned in to last week's episode, the Festival of Pacific Arts was last month in Hawaii. More than 3,000 delegates from more than 25 different Pacific islands gathered in Hawaii for the largest cultural gathering. And after having so much island solidarity, I felt like we needed to have some solidarity focused Fanatsu episodes. And so last week, I invited Neil and Addie from Right to Democracy to come on Fanatsu to talk about the work that their group has been doing in the past year and the wonderful work that they have on the horizon as well. And I'm very happy to continue that discussion into this week, where we are talking to William-Jose Velez Gonzalez from the website Pasquines. And if you do not know about the website Pasquines, then and you come from any of the US territories, or you are attached to the US territories in any way, then you are doing a disservice to yourself. Because one of the most frustrating things, if you are a longtime fan of Fanatsu, or even if you are one of those people who really don't like Fanatsu, you're one of the many trolls or people who do not like me or do not like Fanatsu at all. One of the great things that Pasquines does, one of the things that Fanachu was started around was challenging sort of the national media bias, the national media blind spots, the national media frames, and how they treat territories, how they treat colonies, or how they ignore them, right? And so Fanatsu got started in this way to bring in decolonial narratives, to talk about what was going on in the territories in Guam and the Marianas and so on. And so Pasquines is a website. It's a nonprofit organization that William is the editor-in-chief of, the founder of, 11 years now, which brings together news and context, critical, important context from each of the territories of the United States. And this is such an incredible resource, because even if you come from one corner of the Pacific, or excuse me, one corner of the US empire, the US insular empire, maybe you might know another corner of the US empire pretty well. Like if you come from Guam, maybe you know what's going on in the CNMI, but chances are good that you don't know what's happening in the US Virgin Islands. And chances are pretty good that you don't know what's happening in American Samoa, even though you're both in the Pacific. And even though Puerto Rico is millions of people, chances are good that you probably don't know what's happening in Puerto Rico. And so what Pasquines, I love about Pasquines is that every week when I follow Pasquines on Instagram or on Facebook, when I go to the website, I see news in context about what is happening in each of the different territories. And it is refreshing, it is enlightening, it is amazing. William, thank you so much for joining. Sidusmasi, gracias. Thank you so much for coming on to Fanatsu.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's my absolute pleasure and honor to talk about the work that we've been doing for now more than a decade, trying to connect the territories and even beyond the territories, so that people are aware about the conditions in which people that live in the territories, exist in.
Yeah. And so go ahead and please give us some context on how, what does Pasquines mean? How did it get started? Because, the I was mentioning to you earlier that there's so many, I've heard over the years, so many people kind of talk about connecting the territories in different ways, but it's always such a difficult task, because there's ways in which the territories are similar, but then there's ways in which they're very distinct. And so even if some people might feel like they can forge strong links between a few of them, it's difficult to then get news from one or two of the other ones. And so please tell me, what does Pasquines mean? How did it get started?
So Pasquines, it was an idea that I had right after I finished college, and one that kind of is a little bit of left field. Is my background. I originally went to college for biomedical engineering, not necessarily close to journalism at all. But even while in college, I still had that kind of political itch. I was part of political groups that advocated for a particular solution to Puerto Rico's status issue. And once I finished college, I still had that need, that itch to be involved in what happens in politics. Because of my experience in college, at one point running a blog that kind of covered student government and my experience in student government, I kind of had an epiphany in which I realized that there were a lot of issues with the way that Puerto Rico at that moment was being covered, both by national outlets and by local outlets as well. There's some bias, some shortcomings that I identified, and given that I had, at that point, almost 5 years of involvement in the issue of status, I figured, why not try to pursue a political style blog that kind of addresses everything in a way that, to me, address the issues that I identify. And these ranged from the fact that in local newspapers and local media in Puerto Rico, they would cover what happens in the United States Congress in the international news section. Now, regardless of what everybody's political status preferences, that kind of, to me, felt inaccurate, since the laws that pass in the United States Congress apply equally in Puerto Rico and the other territories. And then on the other side, on the local media, we rarely would get coverage. And if we did, it would often be by somebody that, oftentimes I would read articles or see news reports that would get really simple details wrong, from the way that it would name things, from describing the political atmosphere, from describing basic processes. And it was also often because they would just kind of like parachute a reporter in, not learn the local context, not learn the local idiosyncrasy of Puerto Rico. So I figured, why not try to build a communication bridge to address all these things. I think in previous conversations that I've had with this situation and the whole issue of the territories and colonialism in the United States, oftentimes a big barrier from what I can tell, is that a lot of it is usually motivated by somebody's particular preference for one solution. I kind of wanted to take a step back and then just provide information, let people just ultimately decide based on what the facts are. And that does take correcting some things that are kind of like things that are commonly stated a certain way in Puerto Rico initially, that I've noticed in the other territories, that kind of influence and it might be perpetuate the situation of the colonies, which is, I think, ultimately for me, I'll let everybody decide what their preferred status option is and what the ultimate solution should be. But to me, it is a fundamental problem of the United States, as a country that builds itself as a, kind of sometimes the ultimate democracy, for it to have still more than 3 million people existing in colonial conditions. So based on that principle, I started with the idea of starting a website like that. Talking to one of my closest friends that I got to know through my political involvement, Eduardo Soto. I brainstormed some ideas. We kind of fixated on the concept that in Puerto Rico, there's a lot of street concepts that are related to politics. In Puerto Rico, we have caravanas when somebody wants to run for a particular office, which involve basically renting a pickup truck with a massive speaker that's going to repeat your jingle and announce your candidacy, and then you just drive it throughout town. There's also this concept of posting political flyers repeatedly, usually on the underpasses or in light posts. And I kind of stuck to that one from the design, visual aspect, I should say, because I noticed that a lot of what I identified was a problem in the way that things were covered in the media was due to repetition. So that kind of concept stuck with me. And that's what Pasquines are. Basically, they're political flyers that usually paste in a repetitive fashion in Puerto Rico. And that kind of stuck as the name. And then I explored that with the concept and making the logo and the branding style overall. And it kind of like I didn't conceptualize very well what I was trying to do. And since then it's stuck. Initially our focus was just with Puerto Rico, but eventually I think with everybody that gets involved with this, I realized that and that was another thing that I also realized that in Puerto Rico it's not uncommon to hear that we're the last colony of the world, and that is far from the truth, let alone within the United States. So to me, that was an issue, realizing that not only were we under this situation, but often there were four other territories that we barely hear about. Even the United Virgin Islands that are like about 10 miles to the east of Puerto Rico, we don't really see what happens in their government or overall. We usually just hear if a hurricane hit them before they hit Puerto Rico, and that's about it. So, kind of bridging that gap, I realized my original intent was to bridge Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C., and the federal government. Then I realized that there was also the opportunity to bridge within the residents of the United States territories and kind of start creating that kind of shared experience environment, but also very much explaining that, like you mentioned, there are important differences, and this doesn't mean that there's going to be a one-size solution for all of them in certain situations, but explaining that context, explaining how they're similar and explaining how they differ, and just providing information for everybody, because I think that was the biggest problem that I identified, that lack of awareness, both within the residents of the United States and I mean, of the U.S. territories, and then even with residents of the U.S. mainland who often do not know pretty much anything about the territories.
No, thank you so much for providing that background sort of on where Pasquines comes from. Because I've already gotten a few people that have already messaged me you know, expressing interest in your website because of the frustration over how the territories are covered. And these are people who live out sort of in the diaspora from the Marianas Islands and have that frustration that the only time that they hear about life back home is, as you were just alluding to, when there's a natural disaster, or when there's political corruption, or when there's a military increase or something like that, that there's only particular things which basically make it that the islands matter to national media, and then the rest of the time it's like they don't exist. And so yeah, thank you for that for that perspective on that. And let me just share with everybody, and then I'm going to put the link as well in just a moment. But let me show everyone on the screen the website itself, Pasquines. Here we go. And so 11 years of context of the islands. Congratulations again
Thank
about
you,
that.
thank you.
7 years.
And I
Again,
wanted, and I would add to that, that the context of violence, that's what I use as a kind of a mantra or a slogan, because I think it's what drives the motivation behind everything that we do, that we try to provide important context as to what everything that happens, not just repeating facts or going out by the latest news, but providing important context as to what life in the territories is like.
yes, yes. Hold on one second. Let me hold on one second. Let me load this up again. Here we go. And so let me ask you a question though about this 11 years of context of the islands, because a lot of this is a non-profit, not-for-profit venture, and you do not appear to be Elon Musk, and you do not appear to be funded by Elon Musk. And so the
No.
question is, how do you keep something like this going for 11 years? Um, because
Well,
this is, as we both know, the territories. We were both at New York at a meeting in which there was kind of connections between people from the territories, people who do work on the territories, and some foundations. But traditionally, there's not a lot of interest amongst sort of major funders, foundations in the territories. I think there's been a shift sort of as a lot of foundations and a lot of funders are realizing that it's been grossly underserved for a very long time. Um, but 11 years. So sort of how have you kind of kept this going?
so initially, I think for the first about I want to say close to 7 years. It was just a pure labor of love. I still don't, and there's nobody on staff right now. It's purely been the work of volunteers and interns that have volunteered their time and donated their efforts to making sure. It was just me paying out of my own pocket to make sure that the domain, the website, and any other associated costs were provided for. We tried to kind of pursuing a little bit of advertising, but that wasn't enough. And it wasn't until a few years ago where we discovered the concept of uh, fiscally sponsoring or having a nonprofit organization fiscally sponsor our project, so that way we didn't have to handle the minutiae of running a nonprofit organization, but we're still able to then get donations that were tax deductible under the federal tax code. We first started with the Open Collective Foundation. We now are under the Hack Foundation under their similar system. Unfortunately, our first fiscal sponsor closed last year. So, I mean, earlier this year, I should say. So we had to kind of make that transition. But basically, right now, luckily, we have been able to fundraise a pretty significant amount, enough to not only cover our basic operating costs in terms of the website, in terms of our domain name, but to start actually advertising on social media to a degree that I can now have a continuous ad, kind of like advertising our efforts, trying to build our audience, making sure that we reach more people. And just the other day, I was very happy to find out that we were accepted into a Google News Initiative Fundamentals Lab that's going to help us kind of establish and seek a path towards sustainability that comes with what is to date our biggest fundraising effort. Well, a $20,000 grant that's going to help us implement whatever findings and whatever plan we enact during that lab. So that's kind of how we've gotten it up to this point.
Oh, that's good to hear. That's good to hear. Now, what type of feedback have you received from people in the territories? And so, first of all, sort of your roots are in one particular territory in Puerto Rico. And so what kind of feedback do you get from Puerto Rico itself? And then, what type of feedback then do you get from the other corners of the American empire? And I'm interested in this though, because um, I'm somebody who has always been interested in making stronger connections of solidarity, stronger media connections across the territories. But it's always a difficult thing to do, because there is a give and take. If, for example, a local politician in Guam, for example, starts to talk a lot about what's going on in the U.S. Virgin Islands, then it may negatively impact their career as to why is this person talking so much about what's happening in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Or if a news media company starts to really show a lot of what's happening in American Samoa in Puerto Rico, would people wonder why are you so interested in this? And so it is possible that, there is the aspiration for sovereignty, excuse me, for solidarity, but there is also the gap, in imagination between where people are at in terms of how they see the world and their connections to others, between where we might wish sort of them to be. And so what kind of feedback have you gotten from the communities that Pasquines is connecting?
I think primarily in Puerto Rico, especially out of all the territories, I think it's the most passionate about its politics, especially since in Puerto Rico, the local parties are not driven under a classic or traditional liberal or conservative spectrum, but mostly around the concept of the political status of Puerto Rico. And in that sense, yeah, it's been kind of like in reaction to whatever's published. It's if it's beneficial to somebody's pre their belief and whatever status they favor, can be negative or positive in that direction. We've tried to kind of balance it out and make sure that everybody gets heard to a certain sense, but also kind of, I think, an important thing that I've tried to implement in our coverage and the little details that we put out there, from our style guide to the way that we talk about things. It's understanding that what we're highlighting is that there are 5 jurisdictions within the United States that do not have full rights and equal power. It gets a little dicey in some aspects of, talking about it, because, there are some in Puerto Rico that wish to stay as it is. And I could also say the same about some in American Samoa, where believe the current status is what if they would choose to keep. But we do kind of come from that premise that there is a problem in having 5 jurisdictions that don't have full equal rights and equal power within the United States. And in that sense, I think highlighting certain things, does provoke certain passions. There are some that just say, well, we should leave it as it is. And why are you talking about this? I have something, especially when we try to put ads and try to kind of like reach a higher or a larger audience. We have gotten people from like American Samoa where they're like, well, we don't need this because we're fine with how we are. I think, but I think that's part of the process. And if anything, I don't mind it that much because I think it kind of illustrates the point a little bit more because something that is a pet peeve of mine is when people talk about one place and kind of try to treat it as a monolithic entity. Like, oh, Puerto Rico doesn't want this, and Puerto Rico doesn't want to stay here. That's not how it works. There are people in Puerto Rico who want to stay here. There are people who want to be an independent country. There are those that want to remain as a territory. And the same I could say for pretty much every territory. There isn't a consensus on any of this. So I think it's important in that context to very much provide information so that everybody understands a little bit better, so that they can be a little bit more informed, especially considering that I think with something that has been going as long as colonialism and its modern incarnation in the United States has been, sometimes people kind of make decisions, or should I say, just have kind of a brought over belief that maybe they didn't fully have all the facts. They just were grew up in a family that favored a particular idea and they kind of stuck with it. So I think it's important for everybody to kind of have that intellectual exercise of having all the necessary facts, all the necessary information of precisely stating certain things. Personally, I we do not follow, for example, in Puerto Rico, in Spanish, it is commonplace to refer to Puerto Rico as a país, which roughly translates in English to country. We don't use that terminology because even if you believe that Puerto Rico should be an independent country, even if you understand that Puerto Rico has its own cultural identity, to me, it is a disservice to the reader to describe it as a country when it doesn't meet any of the criteria of what it is conventionally accepted to be a country in terms of an independent government, recognition on the world stage, and participation in international forums that are policy based. Not even going to go into the Olympic slash Miss Universe discussion right now. But like in those contexts, Puerto Rico doesn't meet that definition. So I think it is very important to call things as they are. And what we are in terms of the legal aspect as unincorporated territories, practically speaking, yeah, we don't have to be shy about it. It's 5 colonies. So in that sense, and doing that, we have gotten a little bit of pushback, but I think the mindset behind it is so important because it's highlighting how things are. Because regardless of where you want to go, or if you want to stay in the same space, you should understand where it is that you are. That's a basic thing.
No, I thank you for bringing up the example of American Samoa, because American Samoa is a place that I would love to know more about, because I'm very willing to accept the idea that I think many, even the majority of American Samoans do not wish to be further incorporated with the United States. I'm very willing to accept that idea, but I do not like the idea, when I do not like it though when people kind of try to shut down or try to kind of shut down any idea that these conversations shouldn't happen, or that nobody thinks about these issues. That's what I don't like about when I try to engage. Because for example, as I mentioned when I introduced the episode, the Festival of Pacific Arts, the 13th festival happened in Hawaii in the Pacific just last month, largest cultural exchange. And there is always sort of this tension at FestPac because there are these larger political issues, but it is this cultural exchange. And so how much can the larger political issues enter into the cultural exchange? And that's always, and so, for me, I'm always okay with political issues, larger political issues entering into, and I don't mean necessarily like political partisan issues, but like the larger political issues. Like for me, of course, decolonization, political status, militarization, climate change, these are things that are affecting Pacific Islands in major ways. And so the idea sort of that that we should focus on the dance and then we should just have like a small conference on these issues is, for me, that's problematic, but for most people, that's exactly what you should do at FestPac. And so, but when I talk to people from American Samoa, sometimes that's, they take that position that, oh, you know what, we don't care about these things or we don't have these questions. And I always think, I don't think that's the case. I never accept that idea that sort of, oh, these people think of political things. We are just islanders who don't think about political things. You may not, and this is where, I think the context, as you've been talking about it, is important. The contours of the conversation will be different. So that in Puerto Rico, for example, the contours of the conversation have been for a long time, maybe in particular political status forms, right? And then perhaps in the U.S. Virgin Islands, the contours of the conversation for a while were focused around a constitution. And then whether now we say this, whether it's productive and whether it's moving anywhere in particular, but this is the shape of how things are talked about and how things are framed. And so things are there. And so I don't, so for me, it's American Samoa is always tricky because sometimes people try to from American Samoa try to represent it that it shouldn't be included in these conversations because they just don't have these issues. They don't think about them. And that's I don't necessarily think that's true. Um and so but yeah, no, so but thank you for sort of for bringing that up though, for bringing that up though. Now, I wanted to hear more though because about the US Virgin Islands though and Puerto Rico because this is the Caribbean end. This is the Caribbean end. And so in terms of you providing context for the US Virgin Islands, how is it different than the Puerto Rican context? And so how is it similar? What do you find interesting about sort of providing this context for sort of mainstream audiences and people out elsewhere in the empire?
Yeah, so I think I would say despite there's like we said earlier, there's a lot of similarities, a lot of differences. At the very core, Puerto Rico was invaded by the United States in 1898, along with the territory of Guam. The United States Virgin Islands were purchased in 1917. So around kind of similar time frame within the same, I guess, 20 something years. So in that, I think there might have been a little bit of a difference in terms of resistance or not to the idea of the United States being the metropolitan governing power. In terms of like the cultural aspect, of course, Puerto Rico is predominantly Spanish speaking, and the United States Virgin Islands, that's not the case. It's predominantly in English with addition to the Creole influence. I think a particular fascinating aspect to me is that despite their very close geographical location, we don't see much talking or like interaction as to what happens. And I think it's a little bit one-sided in particular. I think from Puerto Rico side, it doesn't pay much attention to the U.S. Virgin Islands. People, if anything, think about St. Thomas because they went on a cruise ship one time and that's how they know it. But they don't realize, I think a lot of times that they're under the same kind of political and legal practical distinctions and conversations that Puerto Rico is having. I think for our U.S. Virgin Islanders, it's much more common to know more about Puerto Rico. This is just based more on basic things like infrastructure, because a lot of them at one point or another would have had to go to Puerto Rico's main island for medical services or for business purposes. So there's a little bit of a lopsided, I think, relationship in that sense. One I would hope would get a little bit better just in terms of like solidarity. But I think especially in Puerto Rico's case, it's not just with the U.S. Virgin Islands that are, in my mind, kind of the most similar. I think it also happens a little bit with the rest of the Caribbean. We don't hear, I think, in Puerto Rico much about what goes on in the entire archipelago of the Lesser Antilles. And that's something that could be improved. Again, there's always the barrier issue, but to me, those things are a little bit, not as fundamental as they used to be. It's not like we can access Google Translate at these days and kind of figure it out and have a little bit of curiosity as to what's going on in our neck of the woods. For the U.S. Virgin Islands, I think I would say there's also a little bit of rivalry in some things on the political sense. And that's where I think, like what you were alluding to with American Samoa, it's interesting. Because we don't have certain political powers, it's almost like we end up fighting over the little slice of the pie that eventually gets up coming our way. Specifically speaking, I'm referencing that there is a policy in the United States that a certain portion or the taxes that are collected on the rum that is produced in Puerto Rico and the USVI is returned back to the territorial governments. Now, at one point, Puerto Rico and the USVI were kind of like fighting over which one, who was going to get a bigger chunk of that. And to me, that's kind of wild, considering that the funds that are coming that way are not that much to begin with. And because we're focused, I think, on the more intra-territorial fight, we're not focusing on what should have been the conversation, what should have been, well, we're wanting or needing these funds because you're not providing funding in other major areas as you do with the states. Like, for example, with the biggest costs for every state government or territorial government, which are healthcare and education. The territories don't get the same amount of funding. So instead of focusing on or collecting or collectivizing our power as five territories and trying to fight for equal access to funding, we focus on between each other who's going to get a bigger chunk of the round cover over tax. So it's a very intricate situation that I think ultimately just comes down to the lack of political power. Um, and the fact that, because it's kind of lopsided, it's like when Hurricane Maria happened, most of the coverage that we got was for Puerto Rico, rarely mentioned in the USVI, which is why I think for whenever that something does happen in that regard, I always do make it a point to always include that the USVI were probably also affected just because we're so close. So that's usually always the case. I always make it a point, and in that, like going to your earlier question about feedback, I've definitely also realized and had people, thank me for like including the USVI because they, kind of disappear from the conversation as well.
No, yeah, that was that was something that I was very sort of it was intriguing and tra in a tragic sort of way, just sort of how um and for me it's yeah, Puerto Rico is sort of you see as an island that and it would be I'm interested to hear your take on it because for me from the other end of the Pacific, we see Puerto Rico as being like a massive territory, compared to sort of the small islands in the Pacific. But then it's so interesting to see how a territory that's so large and in contrast that is politically, at least in a partisan sense, Puerto Ricans have a lot more electoral value, at least as a voting bloc in certain areas in the United States, and for political parties, compared to Pacific Islanders, for example. And so it's an interesting sort of contrast coming from one end of the Pacific, one end of the American empire, and then looking at Puerto Ricans. But then you see then what happens when like Hurricane Maria, and you see that despite the largeness, despite the closeness, that Puerto Rico is so much closer, there's millions of Puerto Ricans, despite the fact that there's, Puerto Ricans who have, won major awards, that have hung out at the White House with presidents, that despite all that, you still get the same shameful territorial treatment. You still get the same BS media coverage. And then poor US Virgin Islands, which then is in the shadow of the already shadowed coverage of Puerto Rico. And so I'm intrigued then to just hear your sort of your own sort of media analysis of that because as somebody who sees, and who follows coverage of the territories, all the territories, then hearing sort of me coming from one side of it, then you seeing all of it though, sort of hearing your response to that.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is due to the setup of Puerto Rico's local politics and the influence that then has had on its diaspora. Like you said, I would say, like in theory, Puerto Rico does have a lot more power, uh, just because of the size of the diaspora. Right now, in fact, there's close to 5 million Puerto Ricans in the mainland compared to the 3.2 in Puerto Rico's islands. In theory, that should translate to a lot of political power. Because if anything, if you think about, if you compare it to other diasporas in the United States, we come almost second sometimes, according to some metrics, after the Mexican diaspora and the Cuban diaspora. But yet, in terms of achieving policy objectives, in terms of achieving parity, I think, or drawing political attention to like when there is a major problem, it still is a problem. And what I found, I think, in researching and reading about all of this, is that what happens often is that when Puerto Ricans move stateside, they tend to not participate in the political process in the states. They tend to not vote in the same rates. They tend to not run as much as they do in Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, it's always a common like refrain that politics is our national sport. But then when they move to Florida, when they move to New York, they tend to not participate as much. I think that's due to several factors, right? One, I think it's just Puerto Rico handles its elections a little bit differently than the states do. And I think it's so much, I mean, I think on that, I do think it's much better because it's much more simple. Everybody gets elected on the same day every 4 years. And that makes it kind of, much more streamlined for the citizen to participate. But then you have them moving to states where they have off-year elections, and then you have to vote for your city and your county and your state. And there are so many more elected positions than we have in Puerto Rico, like judges, attorney general. Sometimes you have to vote for your dog catcher and stuff like that. So they kind of get overwhelmed. They never had kind of an introduction into civic life outside of Puerto Rico. So they don't participate. So that kind of like hurts that political power that Puerto Rico should have because of its diaspora. And I think those are the consequences that end up having Puerto Rico, you know, still have that kind of treatment. And a lot of it, I think, is also due to we can be influential. Yes, there's a Puerto Rican in the Supreme Court. There are, I think, 4 or 5 Puerto Rican members of Congress. But at the end of the day, we still struggle under the same disparities and inequality. And sometimes, in some respects, sometimes the smaller territories kind of beat us at getting better policy objectives in little things like the Jones Act, which is not equally applied, or access to the Social Security supplementary income program, which was a recent Supreme Court decision. And I think Doña Mariana has access to it, but not Puerto Rico, even though it's the largest. So there's like differences, and you would think that because of just size and population size, it would kind of have much better policy concessions, but it doesn't always. It might get more attention for sure. But I think in terms of like the overall treatment of the territories, there's still the same issues of inequality. And I think that's due to the setup of the whole system. And in a Machiavellian way, I think it was kind of genius of everybody involved in setting up the territorial system in the United States, because people get distracted then in the minutia of every policy, and people kind of, I think, lose track of the whole, or the source of the problem, which is that, well, you just have these jurisdictions that don't have full political power. And when it comes to things like climate change, it's particularly cruel, I think, and ironic to me that the jurisdictions of the United States that are the most vulnerable and constantly suffer the worst effects of the consequences of climate change are the ones with the least political power to do anything about it.
Mm. That's a very sobering point. It's a very sobering point. I wanna I wanna change but thank you for that. Thank you for that though. I want to change gears a little bit though, because I wanted to give you a chance. I've posted onto the, for those of you watching on the live stream, the link to the YouTube page that Pasquines has. And so, one of the things that I find very fascinating is the Google Trends in the different territories. And so I wanted to get sort of you know, some feedback from you, just some of your thoughts sort of on how this started. So how is it that you kind of started this idea to share, information on the Google Trends in the territories? And then just what have you found, sort of just in terms of just some general analysis, like what has it revealed to you to kind of look at this just raw data of what people tend to search for in the territories? Have you found anything that has kind of struck you as interesting or fascinating? Uh, yeah, I've been meaning to ask you this about ever since started coming across your Google Trends in the territories.
Yeah, I think the idea came originally because I subscribed to a newsletter by the Google Trends team that kind of highlights national trends in terms of people searching for particular terms and wanting to understand certain definitions. And the thought came to me like maybe we should be covering what people are searching for, just in the sense of trying to understand what life is in the territories. What better way than to see what they're trying to understand and define what are their interests. I think in the time that I've been doing it, I think it's been more than a little bit more than a year that we've been putting them out. It's fascinating to see when sometimes there's alignment between all five of the territories in terms of what they're searching for, and when they diverge, when certain things just show up under one or two, when Puerto Rico just ignores their national countercurrent. I think most of the time there's usually some influence when I think that the national US zeitgeist moment and cultural moments, there's always something like that, usually in the rising category, like especially sports are a big one. But then you see particular interesting facts. Like for example, how American Samoans tend to be a lot more interested in American football, which is important to highlight because American Samoans have the highest participation per capita than any other jurisdiction in the US in American football because they tend to be very husky players and they have the highest participation. So it kind of makes sense that they would be more interested in American football. On the other side, Puerto Rico and the USVI tend to favor basketball, but then you see how for the US Virgin Islands, they tend to have more interest in the teams that have a player that is originally from the US Virgin Islands uh, in them. And then I think sometimes, most of the times, though, when there is a little bit of a divergence, it's Puerto Rico because it's focused on something that only happens in Puerto Rico, or it's tuned to a phenomenon that happens in Spanish, which recently happened with this Spanish language show called La Casa de los Famosos, or the House of the Famous People, that I think airs on Telemundo, which technically I think I heard this correctly, if I'm not mistaken, was the most watched show in the entire United States at that point when it was airing, and which ultimately had a Puerto Rican contestant win for the second year in a row. So that dominated Puerto Rican searches for like I think a good section. So it's interesting to see those little divergences to when the kind of like moment aligns between the territories, when it aligns with the national conversation. Those are particularly interesting. Beyond that, I think I always struggle a little bit because I notice that a lot of people use that I'm noticing people use Google as a kind of like a bookmark service. As you see, oftentimes the top section are just searches for Instagram or YouTube. They just want to click on that link and find the way there. But then you had that video just now. There was an interesting one because there was a search I think for Japanese something in American Samoa. So that usually only happens in American Samoa. And I think or Korean drama, my bad. Uh, so that was particularly notable to me because I was like, oh, they tend to be the closest one and have I think a larger proportion of Korean tourism than the other territories. So it was interesting to see how that can manifest itself in a different way.
No, I love this. Have is it is it is sort of the use of Google sort of as like the to like as a bookmark or sort of as the place to go to websites as opposed to typing it directly into the browser? Is this a sign of older people?
Yeah, I think so, and I think the fact that it's common across all five territories is also indicative because I think we tend to have a little bit of a older population than
Mm,
the mainland and in other countries, which also results sometimes that the service kind of struggles to provide me terms because there's
mm,
not a high search volume, and
mm,
especially if it's a month where there's been some sort of disaster or like
mhm,
power outage, I've noticed sometimes the numbers kind of tend to go down because well people didn't have access to the internet.
mm. No, but that is a Yeah, I've always found those yeah, when you provide those really fascinating because you can see, for example, just the impact of like American sports, as you were, referencing on sort of the territories and the ways that different territories connect to that, like the preferences in the territories and how like their preferences are sometimes are driven by their their levels of participation, like American Samoa for football, and then the participation of people from the U.S. Virgin Islands in particular sports on particular teams. And so, but then yeah, the Korean drama one that's fascinating, just the unique ones that kind of emerge. And so it's yeah, I've always found those searches just or those data sets just really interesting. And what I love about that, and this is why I enjoy Pasquines, is just that it would be really difficult, to get the information that you provide on your website, like on my own. It would be very difficult, especially because, and I think, despite the fact that so many people talk about the algorithm, even in conspiratorial ways, talk about the nefarious algorithm that's controlling this and that, they still don't realize sort of the role that these things play in dictating what you see and what you don't see. And how, for example, like how likely you or unlikely you are to see something from somebody on the other side of the world, and that it's dictated by the things that you like, the things that the people that you're connected with, and so on. And so, like, if do you have any friends in American Samoa? Have you liked anything related to American Samoa? Well, then, if you haven't, then a news article, or news outlet on American Samoa is not going to show up on your Facebook feed randomly, because the algorithm is not going to decide that American Samoan content keeps you on the platform. And
Yeah.
so that's why and so I think, that's why I love Pasquines, is that, you know, um, if you follow at least, your page on Facebook, for example, it'll consistently show, news from the different territories. And 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 the great thing about it is it's not the sensational news, right? It's a lot of it is sort of it's nuts and bolts in the society, in the community news, but it's integral to what's happening in that society. It's important stuff about like the utilities in the society. It's important stuff about sort of the military policy in this society. It's important stuff about environmental policy that's happening in this society. And and that's what I love about it. And so I wanted to share and so you mentioned that you work with volunteers. And so I wanted to give you a chance to talk about that. And while you're talking about that, I'm going to share on the screen the donation page. But go ahead and just so people know that they can give and they can donate. But tell us about sort of what it's like, because you have volunteers that are in different territories, right? Or that are connected to different territories who help you aggregate and then prepare news.
Yes, I think in our history we've had a close to I want to say 200 interns. It didn't always come from the territories, and I wanted to bring this up because to me it's an important part of what we do. I think I see our efforts as being a little bit twofold. Yes, we provide the news to help people understand it and learn more about the territories. But in the process, we also have most of the work that and most of the articles that you're going to read are the product of interns. Interns that often are from all over the world, but often all over the United States. And at first, I faced that question of should it be limited to just people from the territories? Should it be should we like put a preference on that? And the reason we didn't was because I wanted people to get to learn about the territories in a way that in any other way you probably wouldn't have. And then the kind of like hope and ideal that I have for all of them, and this is something that I say every time that I interview them for a position, is that wherever they may go in their career, and but especially if they go on to pursue journalism in any fashion, I want them to remember that when it comes to talking about the United States, it's not just 50 states and one District of Columbia. There's also 574 federally recognized tribal nations and five unincorporated territories that do not get talked about. And beyond that, three more countries with the Compacts of Free Association that oftentimes people are completely unaware. So in my, architectural plan behind the whole program, the idea and the hope is that in providing this internship program to everybody, regardless of where they're from, we're creating, future advocates for the territories wherever they may end up. And some of them do end up going to big, national news networks. Others get in different careers. I've had some that end up being police officers, others that end up in the corporate world, others in academia. So it's a wild gamut, but I think the important part is that they'll remember that, their learning experience in the academic and professional world involve learning about these islands that often do not get much attention.
No, thank you. I think that that's a good way of professionalizing, you know. Um, it's definitely good to provide that experience for people from the territories, but it is also invaluable to provide it for people not from the territories too, you know, because if more people have that background, that insight, because even especially after talking to so many people who have worked in the federal government around the territories over the years, um, a lot of times life or death issues for the five territories, come down to whether somebody in the room at a given moment knows anything about those territories or does not know
Yes.
anything about those territories. And so different people have told me that, you know, in a room, everyone is gathered, and if if no one knows anything about it, then whatever sort of ignorance, whatever racism, whatever limited sort of knowledge about small islands, small island people, third world people, that will dictate whatever happens. And so you need more people to have a nuanced sort of contextual understanding of these islands and these territories. And so I definitely like the sound of that. I definitely like the sound of that.
No, yeah, and
And
I think that's always a big motivator when I hear sometimes that people that work on the Hill. I have a lot of friends that work on Capitol Hill with Congress, and finding out the large numbers of members of Congress that just do not know that when they're legislating, they're not just legislating for 50 states. They're just completely unaware of like the intricacies of the United States, and that ultimately, as even though every territory came to be the way that it is through different steps, I guess. Ultimately, right now, the sovereignty of each one of the five territories that are residing in the United States Congress. So the fact that its members are not aware is just insane. But it kind of validates why we have to keep doing what we're doing, so that more and more people hopefully get to know and understand it better. Because ultimately the problem is that the conditions that they're subjecting the residents of the United States to, they wouldn't accept for their own district to allow the suffering, the policy differences, the changes in policy without regard or input or even thinking about all of these people, that they wouldn't allow that or tolerate that or think that it's okay for their district. So why is it allowed? Why is it okay then for these islands that are mostly people of color and indigenous individuals? Like that's a problem. So like I think that's a key kind of when sometimes it's a little hard to keep doing it because ultimately it's just labor or passion. It kind of good to remind myself, there's still a need and there's a purpose behind it all.
oh no, no. Thank you for that. And thank you for this time that you've given me. Thank you for this conversation. We are just about our hour is just about up. And so I want to give you a last chance here. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to share? I'm going to put the website back up so people can just take another look at it. But do you have any final thoughts that or final sort of, just that you want to talk about in terms of Pasquines? Any other things that you want to share about it that people can check out? As I've said, it's a great resource. I highly recommend it. But
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think you earlier mentioned it in terms of challenges, and I think the bigger one, like you were referencing the algorithm, is that by default, not a lot of people know or are aware about the territory, so they often don't. The algorithm won't serve the information. So in that sense, anybody that can, even if you cannot donate, just interacting with the content, sharing it, discussing it in any circles is very, very, very helpful. Yeah, in reference to our earlier conversation about how sometimes the media only focuses on the bad, I would encourage them to check out a couple articles that we worked on last year for our 10th anniversary, ranging from perception to citizenship to innovation to identity. And we just tried to cover like different aspects of life on the territories, and they're all named context of. So it's context of citizenship, context of perception, and I try to really do a deep dive into what each of those words meant for the territories. And I'm particularly, proud, I guess, of the sense that we went into areas that are not normally covered, like the context of innovation article focused entirely on things and innovations and inventions that are unique or come from the territories. So that we're not only just saying, oh, we're left behind, there's something bad happened, but seeing us as unique beacons of knowledge and creativity and good things that we have shared with the world until they say make us stand out. So in that sense, I think that's part of our efforts to kind of provide a different angle or provide a different voice. And another thing that I think I would, encourage everybody beyond just sharing our work, if you want to participate in any way, we love having opinion commentary from residents. We love knowing what the issues are, understanding if there's something that is not getting covered in your community, if there's something that you see happening that is not getting the attention that you think it ought to get in contact with us. We have our email on our website. We have a contact form that everybody can reach out to us to. We constantly monitor all our social media channels as well. So any tips are greatly appreciated, and just any involvement from the community, I think is very important. We originally started with a big focus on politics because ultimately affects a lot of your life. I think at one point everybody from the territories has gone on to purchase or fill out a form, and you go to fill out a country, and you may start with U.S., but then you go to the state list, and the territories are not there. So you go back to the country field, and the territories are still not there. So I'm sure everybody has experienced that. That always drives me up a wall because then you're just denied service at that point, and this is because of the conditions that we live in, and a lot of it that's a medium one. There's life and death ones. There's a reason why American Samoa was the last U.S. jurisdiction to have a COVID case because they control their own immigration, unlike anybody else in the United States. It's important to understand all these things. It's important to understand the context, and what causes it all. And that's why we keep doing our work and making sure that we publish the news of the United States territories.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much for this. I have learned so much, and I'm just happy to help get the good work that Pasquines does out there to others. And so thank you once again. Si Diyos
Yep.
masita, thank you once again for joining. And este ki ifinakpo este na episode Fanachu pada todos hamzuni umega por umea kungok si Diyos masita lo. Adios. Este ki manadli.